My parents are both deaf, and from quite an early age, I had an older brother. We would have to interpret the world in all sorts of ways sometimes, most notably television. My parents liked television, and it would have been the early 60s when we first got a television in the house. And so from about the age of 7 or 8, my brother had been doing it before me, but when he wasn't there, I would then attempt to try and explain what was happening on television. And around about 1964, I think it was, BBC Two arrived. And the interesting thing about BBC Two is that when it started, it was very committed to showing a lot of rather avant-garde material, especially films, especially cultured items. But the things that interested my parents were movies. They loved films, but obviously it was difficult when they watched movies a lot of the time, because even though my father in particular, who was a really brilliant lip reader, it was difficult to know for them what people were saying, especially when things were being said off screen and so on. However, with the arrival of BBC Two and the arrival of European films, mostly art house, but not solely art house films, they loved this because those films had subtitles, and we were rendered sort of unnecessary, apart from the occasional use of various other means of communicating with them about the film, the bits we liked and with things we sort of said that happened outside of the subtitles. Anyway, years later, when I became more and more interested in writing and became more interested in acting, I remember thinking that I was very keen on all sorts of dramas, and I was very keen on watching movies. I ended up going to a drama school in Manchester, and I would go to a cinema, which at that time was located in what became a notorious area of Manchester called Hume, and it was a cinema called the Arban. But that showed art house films, things like Battleship Potemkin, things you would never see on television anymore. But I remember when I started going to watch these films, and they were often late at night, an area of Manchester you'd never walk in now, certainly not in the 80s, soon after I was there. I'd go and watch these films with friends, and while I was watching them, I would think, I know this film. And my friends wouldn't believe me. But while watching it, I remember thinking, I've seen this before, and not simply déjà vu, but in a real sense that I knew the film. And I would annoy friends by telling them the ending or telling them what was about to happen next. But it took me a long time to realise that the reason I knew those films is because I had seen them. I'd seen them when I was very, very young. And I'd seen them, watching them with my parents, because they had subtitles. And I think this is one of the reasons that I became really interested, both in drama and film, because it widened my understanding of film, and it widened my perspective of what sort of films could be made. If you were growing up in the 70s or the 60s and 70s, obviously the sort of films that you would have seen would be mostly Hollywood or homegrown. There were, certainly in Birmingham where I grew up, there was no art cinema, or very little. And so an ordinary sort of working class boy like I was would have seen very few of these films ordinarily, but I had. So when it came to getting interested in drama and things like that in later years, I think that must have been one of the origins, in that I was exposed very young to a kind of culture and attitude towards film, but certainly just to life in general, as a result of cinema that ordinarily I would never have been exposed to. And I think it made me fall in love with drama, cinema, art in general, but also it was a way of remembering my parents. It was a way of recognising, even if only unconsciously and accidentally, of the benefit that I'd had being brought up by people who were, in one sense, essentially disabled. So I was incredibly fortunate, while at the same time unfortunate, in having deaf parents, because often it was a trial to go out with them if we were going somewhere, let's say on the bus or into a bank. Often my father would find it difficult for people to understand him, and so I would be used as a semi-interpreter, and that was a very difficult part of growing up, because it became not necessarily embarrassing, but it wasn't the sort of thing you wanted to do when you were a 10 or an 11-year-old. You didn't want to have to go and interpret for adults, especially your own parents. I certainly wanted to be somewhere else. But at the same time, I think that also developed a level of communication that was unusual and certainly not common amongst the people I grew up with. I wasn't just asking questions, I wasn't just talking to people, I wasn't just having a conversation, I was interpreting. I was finding a way of communicating ideas, words, things, phrases that ordinarily one would never have to explain. And I suppose doing it quite young, it meant that my vocabulary had to expand, certainly beyond the realms of my parents' vocabulary. The things I might be asked to question people about and to explain were very simple by and large. But being young, it made it difficult because I was asking questions about ideas that, although were simple, were not the questions of a child, the sort of things that you would ask when you were young. They were the questions that an adult wanted explained, that an adult might find difficult or even embarrassing to ask. But it meant that I think I also found it very difficult to become embarrassed. I ended up training as an actor, and I always thought it was rather interesting that I would meet, even with people who'd gone to drama school, fellow students who found certain things extraordinarily embarrassing. And I always thought, well, why did you want to be an actor if you didn't want to be embarrassed? Because surely that's one of the most important things about acting, is that you're going to be put in situations that you would never meet ordinarily. And that was the joy for me, as well as the understanding that embarrassment was part and parcel of being an actor, that you would also be doing things that would embarrass other people. I thought this was fantastic. And maybe as a consequence of having been exposed so young to the sort of things that would embarrass one ordinarily, meant that I was less embarrassed than it might have been. I certainly remember being in situations where people would demand things of me that I might not want to agree to, and finding within myself the resource to sort of say no or simply agree to it because actually it might be interesting or even rather embarrassing for them rather than for me. The question then of how I transferred this to writing probably comes about as a consequence of not really finding enough within acting, not finding enough of a stimulus that had come from a very early age. It wasn't just enough to be a translator, as an actor is, a person who interprets. I wanted to create. I wanted to do the things that I'd seen other people do. And that, for me, became the most important thing. It was a love of language, which again, I think, developed as a consequence of having deaf parents rather than the opposite. A desire to use language and a real need to explain things because I'd had to spend so much time explaining things to other people, for other people. I wanted to explain things for myself. I wanted to have the right to communicate to other people what it was that I thought, what I felt, what I wanted. And it seemed to me, albeit with a certain kind of arrogance, that I could do that. I watched things and I saw things and I felt there was no way that there were people more capable than I was amongst the people I met. And when I read and saw the things that were going on, I felt certainly that I was capable of doing that, and that the gifts I'd been given, the qualities that I'd grown up with, enriched me and enabled me to be able to take part in that way.